Hi, Bethany.
Hello, Natalie. Are you okay?
Very good, thanks. And you?
I'm good, thank you. I was just wondering, how long have you been a politician?
I'll answer that in a couple of different, I think there's three answers to that question. The first one is I became a feminist at age 5 when I was told, because you're a girl, you're not allowed to have a bicycle. And I went through most of my school years and then my university years forever being told not only that I couldn't do something because I was a girl or a woman, but I shouldn't even want to do that because I was a girl or a woman. So I have been a feminist, more or less as long as I've been conscious. In terms of an awareness of sort of the state of the environment, the terrible state of our world, I would put back to, I did an agricultural science degree at the University of Sydney, and it became obvious to me through that Australian farming in particular wasn't so much farming the soils as mining them and utterly trashing the environment. And so I guess I became an environmentalist, if you like, at that point in time, which was sort of in my early to mid 20s. And then I joined the Green Party on the 1st of January 2006. That was because I'd been in the UK since 1999, but I'd been working nights, so I didn't really join things because I worked with a different schedule to the rest of the world. And I'd stopped working nights. I took a look at the state of the world and thought, I really need to get involved and do something. So I joined the Green Party, and I never would have predicted where it would lead me.
So you've been elected as the former leader of the Green Party since 2012. So what's it like for female MPs in Parliament and in the House of Lords? Working like on a day-to-day basis, is it fun? Is it challenging, that sort of thing?
Just to say that I was the leader of the Green Party for 2012 to 2016, but I was never an MP. We've only ever had one MP, Caroline Lucas. So when I joined the House of Lords in 2019, I continued the Green Party run that our party is in Parliament 100% female, the other peer being Jenny Jones. But I'll talk about the House of Lords because that's what I actually do on a day-to-day basis. The House of Lords is not, compared to the Commons, is not particularly hideous, but that's not much of a recommendation. The fact is that I've put a tweet out where we've had recess, we prorogued Parliament, but in the last week before we did that, I put out a tweet which was focused on, I was asking an oral question, and it's this ridiculous thing where you have to bob up and down, and if more than one person jumps up to ask a question, you either give way or the House collectively decides. And I had to stand there amidst a whole lot of yelling to get my question in, and then I'd half asked the question and the Tories started very loudly barracking me. It's very audible on the tape. And so, the Lords is not actually usually like that. That was fairly uncommon in the Lords, but they are enormously male-dominated spaces. And, I have a confession to make, because many years ago when I was the editor of the Guardian Weekly, I did a feminist event. And there was actually a group of young women who were campaigning. Their campaign was to move the Commons and the Lords out of Westminster into a modern purpose-built building. And they said, there's all these dead white males and the whole atmosphere of the place is like a private fee-paying boarding school. We should change this. At the time, I said, well, I don't think that's the biggest issue. But actually, I think we have a broken political system. Obviously, moving it wouldn't be the sole thing that fixed it. But actually, it's going to be very hard to fix it remaining in the environment we're in now. So it's a misogynist, male-dominated, aggressive, extremely unproductive and unhelpful environment for producing a decent kind of politics.
Do you feel intimidated by the House of Lords because of the title Lords? It's kind of stereotypically male dominated. So do you have that intimidation as well?
Necessarily the title is the problem. I must admit that I had to get over a small boggle the first time I stood up and said, I entirely agree with the noble Lord, the Duke of Wellington. There is something very strange about that. And every time I say Duke of Wellington, I think of his most famous predecessor. And it's a very strange environment. And the fact that 92 people, now all male, and if there are going to be females, they can only come from Scotland, the 92 hereditary peers, that is an absolute anachronism and ridiculous. But I don't necessarily think that the title is really a big problem. I mean, it is interesting that we are all collectively referred to as a group of lords, even when there's actually ladies, baronesses among them. That's the formal terminology, which, you know, has gone out in most other parts of society. So it is, I mean, the whole place is just utterly archaic. The name is just one small element of that total archaism.
So you got your live peerage from Theresa May. What did you do to get on her good side to get that?
Well, it wasn't actually me personally. What happens is when peerages are offered to opposition parties, it's offered to the whole party. So the party itself decides who that person is. So the Green Party was offered a peerage. And what happened was, we actually normally in the Green Party have a process of the whole party votes for the list of people who are next in line to be at the peerage. We were actually in the middle of that process, and I was on the short list. And because we didn't have time to do the full process, we had the regional council, we had a hustings, and they voted. So I can say, like Jenny Jones before me, I was voted into the House of Lords, which is not something anyone from any other party or indeed the crossbenchers can say.
I hope you've seen what's going on in Parliament with recently with Angela Rayner. I was just want to hear your thoughts about this.
I said the House of Lords is not as bad as the Commons, but that is an extraordinarily low bar. I mean, what is it? 53 MPs, and I think we can safely assume virtually all of those will be male, are currently being investigated for allegations of sexual harassment. You know, the way the story about Angela Rayner came out and was covered was absolutely horrendous. You know, it does sometimes feel like we're back in the 1950s, and the House of Commons really hasn't moved out of the 1950s in many ways. And I think what's focused on is when an MP is targeted in the way that Angela Rayner was. But in many ways, what's even worse is the treatment of staff members of MPs. Very often, quite a lot of them are very young, often, you know, first job out of university. And there have been some horrendous cases that we know about, and I'm sure many more horrendous cases that we don't know about. And the whole building is an extremely toxic environment. And, you know, it's those people who I'm most concerned about is the staffers. And there's a proposal around to, which has been around for many years, and Caroline Lucas has previously backed it, that in, say, the London Assembly, staff are actually employed by the Assembly for certain staff members, but their employees, the whole management, the way they're looked after is managed by the London Assembly, or could be managed by the Parliament. And that would take away from the fact that, you know, the person, the MP who's now, you're a junior staff member, you know, you started a month ago, first job, terribly keen to work in Parliament and do well, and the person who employed you suddenly starts talking to you inappropriately, and it's an enormously difficult situation. Whereas at least if they'd been employed independently, that would be a much better situation. I think there's a really strong argument for that.
You said it was a toxic environment. What can be done to change that then?
Well, I've already mentioned, you know, I think moving out of Westminster into a modern purpose-built building, preferably in Birmingham or somewhere like that, would be a good idea. But I think what we have also is the situation where MPs, they're elected under the first past the post system. They're not really accountable to anybody. There's no structures. You know, the UK is not a democracy. Boris Johnson got 100% of the power with 44% of the vote in 2019. We have a situation where with a majoritarian system, we seesaw more or less eventually from one side to the other. And that produces an environment where people are at each other's throats. It's a competition between two sides. You know, it's not actually true, apparently, to say that the distance between the two front benches in the House is actually a sword length, but it might as well be the general atmosphere. Whereas if you look at Scottish Parliament, Welsh Parliament, both places that have a much higher percentage of female MPs and members, they're arranged in a circle. They very often produce, or they're designed to produce coalition governments. So people know that they have to work with everyone around the house. And so the idea is, of course, people have political conflicts and political disagreements, but the idea is this is a body working for the good of everybody in a constructive way. And that's the very opposite of the way Westminster is structured.
How would you define feminism? Because you said you're a feminist since you were 5 years old, but how would you define it?
I've always rather liked the line that people call me a feminist when I say I don't want to be a doormat. But more seriously, I would say that feminism means creating a world where everyone in that world, whatever their gender, is given a full opportunity to develop their skills, potentials, to live a rich life. And that to me is what feminism is. That doesn't mean, I would disavow, it does achieve some things, but I would disavow liberal feminism as the idea that you continue with the system we have now and women just have better chances in it. I spoke to a feminist group a few years ago, and it really struck me that just as within environmentalism, the green movement more broadly, what we need is, the slogan on the streets is system change, not climate change. And I would also say it doesn't rhyme as well, but, system change, not anti-feminism, which is what we have now. Feminism demands a complete change of our current system.
You said we have anti-feminism. What do you mean by that?
Well, our society now, in all kinds of ways, prevents women from fulfilling their full potential, from having the same opportunities that males have. And that's true whether it's, someone in a community who's working really hard caring for a relative has to live on the wholly inadequate £60 a week carer's allowance. That person is being denied the chance to live a full life. It's true of the fact that someone in a big company hits a glass ceiling. It's true in the fact of girls who don't go to an event because they really don't want to come home after dark because they're scared of the violence on the streets. In all kinds of ways, our society is profoundly anti-feminist, anti-female.
How many courageous stories do we have to tell to get more women on board, to get the members of the public on board to get a more equal parliament? How many more stories do you have to tell?
That's an interesting way of phrasing it, because I think what we have to tell is not so much more stories, but bigger stories. Because I said what we need is system change. And there's all kinds of individual measures that individually can address those things I was talking about. A universal basic income would put that carer in a far better position. A quota for women on boards would put that person in the big company in a better position. Better policing, more education for juries, all kinds of things could make the streets safer. But we still have a system that's basically built by men for men. And until we entirely rebuild that economic, social, political system. So what we have to do is tell bigger stories that paint the picture of what that feminist world looks like. I would say it's a green world with a universal basic income, with us looking after nature, living a rich life, a 3 or 4 day working week as standard with no loss of pay. All of those kinds of changes are not necessarily things just directly aimed at women, but that create a society in which everyone has the opportunity to flourish. So we've got to tell those big stories of how where we are now is not inevitable. It's the result of political changes in the past. We can build a different kind of society in the future. And, history is not pre-written. It's made by what people do. So at the core of that is empowering people. I say to people, politics should be what you do, not have done to you. And in that feminist society is one where, everyone is engaged, working with others for a better society in all kinds of different ways. So that's the story we've got to tell. I'm not saying don't campaign on one particular issue like quotas on boards or something, but understand that, as we're just seeing, as we're talking today, tragically, the leak of the Supreme Court judgment coming out of the US, I'm sure that for decades, women in the United States thought they had won the right to control over their own bodies. It now looks very likely they're about to lose that most basic of rights. So you can win individual victories and take steps forward, but unless you actually change the whole system, you're going to have to keep fighting the same battles again and again. I've often cited Sheila Rowbotham, the feminist historian. I heard her launch one of her books saying, we thought in the 1970s, we'd win one thing and then we'd move on to the next thing and then we'd move on to the next thing. But we find ourselves having to fight the same battles again and again. And so it's really crucial that we understand that we need to tell that story of a different kind of society.
You said, like, from the 1970s as well, women had to fight the same battles again and again. But what do you, from a woman's point of view, what do you have to change to get more people on board, to get men on board? Because there are men out there who would consider themselves as a feminist. It's not just female dominated, but what do we need to bring to get more people back on board, to change the narrative and stuff?
I think we're in a great position now at this moment, because if you went out and asked, did a survey in society, do you think our politics is broken? You get about 100% positive response. If there's a survey that's been done over many years, asking people, do you think your kids and grandkids will have a better life than what you've had? And the answer is increasingly massively negative. So what we have is a society where people are looking for new answers, new ideas, different ways of doing things. Because, when I first joined the Green Party in 2006, it was really tough to tell a story of change. If you said to people, oh, we're trashing the environment and there's 16% of pensioners, a large majority of them women, living in poverty, they go, oh, it's all right, Gordon Brown's abolished boom and bust, and we're going to sail into the sunny uplands, and we know the kids have to worry about the climate change, but that's a couple of generations hence. In 2006, the system seemed to be working. We're now in a situation where our current economic, political, social systems clearly are not working, so people are looking for alternatives. And what we have to do is look at a foundation underlying a huge amount of this, underlying all of it really, is that we have run our society for the economy. We've got to do these things because it'll build GDP. We've got to have more jobs, get more women into jobs. People define themselves by their jobs. We have to have, more aspiration. All of this is focused on servicing the economy. If we actually move to say we have to live within the physical limits of this one fragile planet, and I'd say, a foundational feminist economics is a book called Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. This is a way of, we look after nature, we look after people, we acknowledge that we need, given the state of the world the old system had created, we need the skills, talents and ability of everybody now to have a chance to choose to contribute in their own way. And so that means, not a society focused on jobs, but a society focused on people looking around, seeing what needs doing and having the resources, the time, the energy, the space to do that for themselves. And that's a feminist society. That's, I'd say, a green society.
The COVID-19 pandemic has affected everyone. But when you look at an analysis that happened, it shows that women who was in powerful positions, who led the country, had lesser COVID-19 pandemics and compared to men who run the country. Do you see that as a positive change, positive sign that women can lead these, can lead countries? For example, in New Zealand, you got Jacinda, who's done so much for New Zealand. So what do you think about that?
I think I'm always very wary about focusing on one individual and thinking it's this one individual as the hero who's leading us to a successful world. I think one of the things you can look at is societies that have elected women leaders. What kind of political systems do they have? What kind of social systems do they have? How do they operate differently? And, I don't know that if Theresa May had been in control instead of Boris Johnson, well, I think there would have actually been, in this particular case, a great deal more competence, although that's more to do with individuals rather than systems. But, I think I think we need to be wary of the idea, right, the answer is to put one woman at the head and, the woman will lead us. Jacinda Ardern is there because New Zealand has a proportional electoral system. They used to have a first past the post system like the UK does, but they managed to navigate their way through a system of 2 referendums to arrive at a truly democratic system. Interestingly, New Zealand, it had a real phase of extreme neoliberalism, extreme inequality, some really dreadful political decisions made, but it managed to pull itself out of that and got itself to the place where Jacinda Ardern was there at the right time. So I think, rather than focus on individuals and say the answer is one woman, I want a society where there's huge numbers of women involved and engaged. I do think, I believe in quotas. I think a 50-50 parliament would be a good idea, because that would just inevitably be a more representative parliament. And there's a great campaign, by the way. I have to give them a little plug here, 50-50 parliament, excellent campaign. It's not one person or even one small group. It's empowering everybody in society that's really crucial. And I think New Zealanders felt more empowered, informed, engaged in the whole process of tackling COVID-19 than did people in the UK, for example.
So the UK has only seen 2 female prime ministers, Margaret Thatcher and Theresa May. Some countries may say that as progression, but others may see that the UK is sexist because they've only had 2 female prime ministers. So I was wondering, how do you get more women interested in politics, because it is quite a niche subject, and get them into public office?
I disagree with you on politics being a niche subject. Politics impacts on all of our lives every day, every minute of every day, every year, right through. But I think the people in power now, the current system wants people to think politics is that strange, weird thing that happens down in Westminster or happens in Cardiff, it's nothing to do with me, except I know I'm supposed to roll out and give a vote every 4 or 5 years, even though I often know my vote will have no impact whatsoever if I live in a safe seat. We really need to understand the definition of, my definition of politics is people getting together with their friends, their classmates, their family, their work colleagues, whoever, and making the world around them a bit better, changing the environment in a broad sense. And so, I go and talk to a lot of schools, colleges and universities, and my message is always that politics should be what you do not have done to you. And organising a litter pick is politics. Starting a campaign in your school to get rid of the plastic in the canteen, to get rid of the plastic cutlery even, that's politics. So what we need is people knowing that they can personally make a difference. And it doesn't always have to be the most enormous, ginormous thing out there. Sometimes people say to me, well, how do I stop the climate emergency? And that's a really big thing to be starting your politics on. Look around and see what's around you, and maybe do something. I mentioned plastic cutlery. I was at a school and they invited me for lunch, and because I was a VIP, I got proper cutlery, and they were all trying to eat their baked potato with plastic knives and forks. And I said, here's a great campaign. Get real cutlery for everybody. Good for the environment, might even save the school some money. You get to eat your lunch properly, win-win all round, and that would be political.
Mm. You're such an influential person in terms of being in the House of Lords. But do you feel like we've still got a long way to go in terms of being a representative in the House of Lords, because you did say it's a very male dominated. So how do you get more women into the House of Lords to try and balance, to get that gender balance as well?
Well, for many reasons, my answer to that would be, let's have an elected upper house. My proposal would be an upper house elected proportionally through what were the European regions, because that's something that's sort of already there and existing. And I think you would find, certainly, if you look
how would that work then? Because it's a privilege because it's signed by the Prime Minister, it's signed by the monarchy, signed by the Queen. So how would that work in terms of getting elected upper house?
I mean, what it basically means is you need to pass a bill. I mean, I actually have a bill, you can look it up. It's the Elections and Other Reforms House of Lords Bill 2019. It was the first thing that I put down. There's previous changes to the House of Lords have happened without any kind of referendum or anything. Under our current constitutional arrangements, there's no need. And in fact, the plan was always certainly to get rid of all the hereditaries. The reform that reduced the number of hereditaries was actually supposed to be a staging post along the way to a house with at least some elected members. So there was all, it's a plan that's been around for 100 years or something. Literally, all you need to do is pass a law. One of the interesting things is that what would happen if you had a fully elected House of Lords, and I talk to a great organisation called Make Votes Matter very often about this, and they're razor focused on getting a proportionally elected House of Commons, and they're a bit concerned that an elected House of Lords would be regarded as a sop. But you would immediately have the most enormous constitutional crisis if you had a democratically proportionally elected House of Lords, because it would be obviously unavoidably more democratic than a Commons if the Commons continued to be elected the same way. And in terms of how this would certainly increase the number of women, I know that the Green Party, I would think it would be highly likely Labour and the Lib Dems would have some kind of system like we do in Scotland with lists of zip lists, so that you end up with the list having one male, one female. Some parties might decide to have even more women in. And so that would be how that sort of voting system could actually very easily put in a fairly elected thing. If you had an open list system like they use, for example, in Italy, I suspect the public would probably elect even more women. But certainly one way or another, the evidence is that proportional systems put in far more women representatives.
Why is that then?
I think that's an interesting question. I mean, it's a bit chicken and egg in some ways, because more progressive places have proportional systems. But I think it's partly, I mean, it is very hard to manage. I mean, Labour's been through all sorts of hoops in terms of having all women shortlists, and that's been abused, and then it was found to be illegal. And it's all, if you have a single member system, it's very hard to manage things. And once you have someone in place, they stay there for a long time. And, this is where we come to system change again, because one of the things you find is that women tend to serve shorter terms in the Commons than men do. So the men stay around. So you gradually accumulate more and more men. And of course, historically, it always was more and more men. So, there is a structural element of the system that allows you to manage for gender much more easily than you can with a first past the post single member system.
I just want to put this question to you as well. You're a white woman, you're a powerful woman, and sitting in the House of Lords. Can you explain the difference to me, the difference of white feminism and black feminism? Why, if black feminism is seen as a negative thing in the media's eye and the politicians' eyes, could you explain to me that?
First of all, I would say that I absolutely don't share that view, and I absolutely am an intersectional feminist. And actually, talking to you caused me to dig up an article where I spoke to The Guardian 16 years ago, when I was the founder and it had been for some years operating the Carnival of Feminists. And this is, I need to explain this a little probably, because then it's not something that's around these days, but back in the days when blogging was a new and exciting thing, and this is BT before Twitter, how bloggers with similar interests found each other was there were blog carnivals. So we used to have once a month a roundup. It was hosted on different blogs of feminist blog posts from around the world. And one of the things that I noticed even then, and I commented back 16 years ago, was that women of colour all around the world experienced far more abuse, far more trolling, had a far tougher time of it than did white women. And there is, of course, double, treble discrimination, if depending on social class and other things as well, and disability. And so, I think that the organised feminist movement has often people who've been identified often by the media as the leaders of the feminist movement, have very often been white and have very often been liberal feminists that have utterly failed to acknowledge and put forward and ensure that a range of voices were heard. I can only be one person in the House of Lords, but one of the things that I try and do very often is to actually quote a whole range of people, a whole range of sources, a whole range of writers in the Lords from all kinds of different backgrounds. And so one of the things I said I would do was bring the voices of the streets into the House of Lords. That's a phrase I used in my maiden speech. And so we have to acknowledge that our society is hugely, deeply discriminatory. I mean, my fellow peer, Jenny Jones, has done a huge amount of work on discriminatory stop and search over many years. We have a society in which people suffer huge ranges of discrimination, and those discriminations multiply on top of each other. So one of the things that I do on a practical level, as well as try to quote lots of different people, is I also really am always I encourage everybody, particularly women, but particularly women of colour or women who suffer other disadvantages, to get involved in politics and try to support them, encourage them, provide some help and assistance where I can. Those things are crucially important. That's why I was talking before about how it's not about one individual. It needs to be about a whole range of different people working together, and it's crucial that those are a diverse, in all kinds of different ways, range of people.
How many people of colour are in the House of Lords in comparison to the white supremacy?
Grossly underrepresentative of the country. I can't tell you the precise number. I'm not sure anyone's ever produced the precise number, because there are about 800 lords, and there's about probably about 200 we never see. The ones who are regularly engaged, there is some great people. Coming in with me was Sir Simon Woolley, Lord Woolley, founder of Operation Black Vote. There's Lord Patel, who's a doctor, who tends to focus on those kind of issues. There is, a dozen or so, Floella Benjamin, Baroness Benjamin. There is a range of people there, but it's not in any way representative of the country, just as the whole Lords is utterly unrepresentative of the country.
Why is Black feminists from the past underrepresented in the eyes of history?
I mean, I would say this is, again, you can say put an intersectional lens on history. One of my pet things before politics and the Green Party took over my life, I was trying to write a book on the history of the women of London. And because when I moved to London, I saw all those blue plaques up on the walls, and nearly all those blue plaques were to men. And I said, where are the women? And I started that, and I'm trying to, not very effectively at the moment, but trying to actually run a blog on the history of the women of England. And one of the things that you find is, for example, in Tudor London, Elizabeth's first time, there were actually lots of black people, probably more black men than women, but lots of black people. But they've disappeared from history, just as the women have disappeared from history. And so, one of the things I'm always trying to do is highlight women, particularly women suffering from intersectional disadvantages from the past. But it can be really difficult because of that discrimination. Very often things were not written down, and so historians have to be very creative and to look into ways in which they can find and uncover those stories. And I think a lot of that work is now being done in history departments. Anyone who's interested in history, if you look around, there are some historians that the book I'm thinking of is Black Tudors, is a great book that uncovers a lot of that hasn't been covered before, but there's a lot of work like that happening in academia. And it's really crucial that the work doesn't just happen in academia, but also gets out into the public realm and, gets into school curriculums, so that the people know and can see people from the past like themselves, and indeed not like themselves, to understand that the world, the UK, has always been a highly diverse place.
From Australia, you mentioned that because you're an environmentalist as well with the Australian farmers and stuff. Have you ever been in the political world in Australia as well?
directly. I was always a journalist in Australia. So being a journalist, I wasn't directly involved in politics, but I'm very proud of the fact, of course, being a journalist is intensely political in a non-party sense. And one of the things that I'm proud about is I was the news editor on the Northern Daily Leader, which is based in Tamworth, which is fully equivalent to something like the Yorkshire Post in the UK, size-wise. And it was when we had the Mabo ruling, which gave Aboriginal land rights inadequately and insufficiently, but nonetheless was a big step towards Aboriginal land rights in Australia. And I did a lot of work, and I'm proud of the fact that we had a very fact-based but very informative and challenging a lot of the main right-wing narratives about the Mabo ruling. There was a lot of absolute nonsense going around, basically saying, oh, you're going to come and you'll lose your back garden, sort of nonsense. And I'm very proud of the fact that as a journalist, I made sure my newspaper, covered that very sensibly and factually and set out the reasons why we should have Aboriginal land rights. So, I was always doing politics. And of course, I was at the Bangkok Post, and one night I was able to get on the front page of the paper that wouldn't have been otherwise, a story about how women with HIV in Thailand were being forced to have abortions if they found they were pregnant without any real choice at all, without any information. And, just the fact of being able to be as a journalist, you do have some space to influence things. So, yes, I've always done politics within that political frame. And, if for journalism students, I learned very early on, what do you do when you're a journalist and you have to cover people who you really, really can't stand? And it was probably only my first weeks as a journalist, and there was this deeply fundamentalist Christian march came through town that wanted women barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. And so I wrote up the story in the paper because, that was my job as a journalist. This had happened, but I just quoted all of their own words, and I think they looked exactly like the people who they were through quoting their own words. And so, sometimes as a journalist, you've got to do that, but there are ways.
So what drove you to the UK to become a politician? Was there anything specifically that you wanted to come to the UK?
So there were two things. One, the Australia that I grew up in had very little awareness of Aboriginal history, Aboriginal culture. And so I came to the UK as a backpacker in 1990. And I touched the wall of St. Bartholomew the Great Church in London and went, wow, this is 1,000 years old. And then I went to, Hagia Sophia in Istanbul and went, wow, this is 1,600 years old. And so the history and the culture, the British Museum, I loved in the UK. And also as an English language journalist, London media is it. So those were the two things that drew me to the UK. But I'd also say that, I very much moved to Europe because it's the UK is still better than Australia. I mean, Australia has essentially no public realm. Australian people, certainly in my childhood, lived on quarter-acre blocks, got in the car and drove out their driveway if they were going anywhere. No one walked. There was no public spaces where people gathered. And I came to Europe and saw people gathering in public spaces. I can remember